Hello there. Welcome to the Saroy channel, wherever you are in the world, and so much love to each and every one of you, and welcome if you're a new subscriber. It's so lovely to have you on board. And as I keep saying, there's nothing that beats a fabulous story, and I've got a fabulous story for you tonight, because there's no greater entertainment, is there? It's lovely to go back to the old ways when stories were such a big deal. I think we're getting back there again. So let's start with tonight's story, but before we do, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, click the notification bell and the thumbs up, and let's get started with tonight's story. Dear Sarah, and all your lovely listeners, I came to the swift conclusion from a very young age that some people just enjoy being objectionably disrespectful, brutally blunt, and insultingly rude. And that certainly could be said for our immediate next-door neighbour. Growing up, the cattle rancher who lived next door to us was possibly one of the most cantankerous, fractious, disagreeable men you ever had the privilege of meeting. We would call him Mr. Grim behind his back, but to most people in our town, he was known as Farmer Grimshaw, and suffice to say, his captious reputation preceded him. It would seem that his obstreperous, opinionated, wilful, rather waspish approach towards other people meant that even the friendly folk in our town did their very best to avoid him, much like the Black Plague. If you were a woman having a bad hair day, you would soon learn to keep out of Mr. Grimshaw's way, for if you didn't, you could be assured that Mr. Grimshaw would soon let you know about what a sorry sight you looked indeed, as there was no holding back, nor any measure of restraint on his part. His ruthless cutting tongue could be as sharp as a razor. I remember on my mother's bad hair day, when she just wasn't feeling all that great, Mr. Grimshaw said to her, "See, Anna, by the looks of things you shouldn't have got out of bed this morning. You're a sight for sore eyes, and that hair of yours would make a hedgehog's spikes look flat." You may think he was trying to be funny, but humour was not in Mr. Grimshaw's personality. He was brutally honest, to the point of being offensive, and sometimes even downright cruel. He was a man in his late 40s, early 50s, whom had never been married, although at the time there were speculative rumours that abounded that he had been married at one point, and that his first wife had abandoned him on the second day of their marriage, as she had had about as much of him as she could take. But we thought the unfounded, hypothetical rumours were just idle conjecture. But Mrs. Adams, who was the town's biggest gossip, swore they were true. Farmer Grimshaw supported a full head of wispy, straw-coloured hair. He had those blonde caterpillar eyebrows that were incredibly bushy. When he furrowed his brow together, it looked like there was a single long albino caterpillar crawling above his eyes. The man had two blue eyes that were deep set in his face, and close together, although one of his eyes was greyer than the other. But they were far too close on his face. Mr. Grimshaw had thin, mean lips, the top lip being so faint it was barely visible. He wore a miserable scowl, or what my brother Jack would always refer to as an upside-down smile on his face. "I don't think he can smile the right way up," he'd say to me. I believe my brother was right, as never once did I see the man smile normally. Even the way Mr. Grimshaw walked was like a belligerent octopus swinging his arms back and forth, as he was always in a hurry. But my mother used to say that he likes to give off the quintessential "look at me, I'm so important" vibe. Mr. Grimshaw was exceedingly wounding. Without even trying, he had a stinger on him like a hornet, and his ability to offend someone ran as smoothly as a swift current dashing furiously over rocky boulders. My mother used to tell me it's called not having a filter, which meant he told you exactly what he thought. And sometimes you don't want to hear exactly what someone is thinking, as it might be too close for comfort. Like when Jack, my brother, started to learn to play the violin. He played what he'd learnt from a plethora of lessons to the townsfolk. Everyone clapped in encouragement, but Mr. Grimshaw said, "I'd quit while I was ahead, son, if I were you. Why everyone here is clapping, God only knows, but your music is horrendous." Mr. Grimshaw, people would say, "The boy's doing very well. He's only just learning." "Nonsense,"
piped Mr. Grimshaw. "You've either got it or you haven't. I'm sure the moment Picasso put pen to paper, everyone could see the man's potential. But Jack here has no embryonic prospects as a musician. I'm sorry, but it's the truth, and the truth needs telling." Of course, my brother had been completely gutted by the stinging assessment, and soon packed up playing the violin. He was so discouraged. Mr. Grimshaw had reduced many women in town to tears, which was something my father could not abide. But there wasn't a whole lot he could do about it, as despite his very best efforts to try and persuade Mr. Grimshaw to bite his tongue and restrain from saying something hurtful, it was poignantly evident my father's sagacious wisdom fell on deaf ears. Mr. Grimshaw inadvertently liked to set the cat among the pigeons, ruffle everyone's feathers, and I have a sneaky suspicion he actually enjoyed stirring the pot, although he never admitted as much. I remember he told the baker's wife, Orla, that he wasn't surprised her husband was leaving her. "I'd leave you too, Orla," he said. "Look at you. You're enormous. You're like a bloody hippo. I've been to Africa, and those things are massive, and very frightening too. If they roll over on you, you're as good as dead. Did you know that? They'll crush you to pieces." He was possibly terrified that you'd roll over on him during the night, suffocate him in his sleep. I'd feel the same way. Needless to say, I'm not surprised there aren't any doughnuts left to sell this morning. You've probably finished eating them yourself. Most of them are insulating your belly right now, which is why when I come in here to buy a baker's dozen, they're all bloody sold out every bloody time. "I have a slow metabolism, Mr. Grimshaw," she said gingerly. "For your information, I don't actually eat doughnuts. I'm on the Atkins diet. I'm not allowed any carbohydrates. I'm very well aware, Mr. Grimshaw, that I'm overweight, but that's not the reason I'm getting a divorce from my husband." She was trying her best to fight back the tears gathering at the back of her pretty brown eyes. "You don't eat doughnuts. I don't believe a word of it all. And this slow metabolism nonsense. Poppycock, that's what they all say when they justify being so big. It's an excuse, that's what it is." Orla had burst into tears. She'd run to the back of the bakery to recuperate, but we could hear her crying. Everyone had looked at Mr. Grimshaw, with jaws dropping to the ground, eyes as wide as saucers, as so astonished were they by his humiliating, condescending, and bluntly offensive words, as if they couldn't quite comprehend that he'd actually said what he'd said. I think they were so confounded that their response to this unfortunate scenario was somewhat hijacked by shock, as they didn't come to Orla's defence, as they probably should have done so in the circumstances. Suffice to say, the incapacitating effects of shock can rather render one speechless. My mother thankfully did react. She was one of few women in our small town that was not intimidated or daunted by Mr. Grimshaw in the slightest. Something, I think, that actually made Mr. Grimshaw have a clandestine respect for my mother. She was not afraid to confront him on any subject, and she believed you always needed to stand up to a bully, to assert your confidence, and the bully would retreat. She was right about that. "Mr. Grimshaw, that was very uncalled for, talking to Orla like that. You've really upset the poor girl." Mr. Grimshaw let out a huge exasperated sigh. "What's wrong with people? What on earth is wrong with people in this God-forsaken town? Too bloody frightened to step on anyone's toes by telling the truth? Orla needs to know. She's getting far too fat. It isn't good for her health." "You don't need to inform her about that, Mr. Grimshaw. I think big people already know they're overweight. They don't need a big bully like you to rudely point it out to them." If that wasn't bad enough, he told the woman who runs the diner in town that she was like mutton dressed up as lamb. "You try to look young, Miss Campbell, but you're not fooling anyone, so I would give your short skirts a miss. You're not doing anyone any favours showing off those unsightly knobbly knees of yours." Luckily, Miss Campbell did not suffer fools gladly.
She had enough plucky spunk in her to give him as good as he gets. She delivered him his T-bone steak and the glass of Coca-Cola he'd ordered, which she wilfully poured all over his lap to maximise her revenge. "Oh, I'm so sorry, Mr. Grimshaw. Really I am. It was a dreadful accident," she piped, with an exaggerated look of concern on her face. And then she tried to dab his pants with a plethora of kitchen roll, which made Mr. Grimshaw look chastened. The obnoxious cattle rancher scowled at Miss Campbell and pushed her away with his arms. "Get your hands off me, you klutz! You're a clumsy, stupid idiot!" He staggered to his feet, retreating to the gentlemen's toilets, and returned with the front of his pants completely soaked. Miss Campbell struggled to conceal the smug smile that was developing on her face. She called out to all the diners, "Everybody, please don't look at Mr. Grimshaw's pants. He's wet himself. He's had a little accident, I'm afraid to say." There were snorts of laughter around the diner, as people appreciated the joke, and Mr. Grimshaw's abashed scarlet face was a pleasing sight for many to see. "I've not wet myself," he snapped churlishly. "This bloody woman over here poured Coca-Cola all over the front of my pants, if you must know." "It's all right, Mr. Grimshaw," cried out one of the men in the diner. "Your secret's safe with us. I shan't be telling anyone about your unfortunate little accident." On a few occasions my mother had invited Mr. Grimshaw over to our place for an evening meal. She told us that whatever we may think of him, he was our next-door neighbour, and it was the polite thing to do, to invite him over to dinner. "I believe emphatically that neighbours should always be on good terms with each other," she had insisted. "We need to make an effort to get along with Mr. Grimshaw, even if he is a difficult character." I remember when the disagreeable man had come to dinner. He parked himself comfortably on our settee. My mother gave him a Scotch whisky, which he had gulped back in one swig, extending his arm out for a top-up seconds later. Mr. Grimshaw had the constitution of an ox. He could knock back excessive high alcoholic content drinks without becoming completely bladdered in the process. "I hope, Sienna," he says to my mother, "that you don't cook with garlic. I hate bloody garlic. People cook with it as they're so ineffectually crap in the kitchen, so they use it to disguise their lack of culinary prowess. These days it's in everything, adulterating food with its overpowering flavour. You can't go on the underground in France anywhere without being completely overwhelmed and inundated by the ghastly smell of garlic everywhere you go. Some people positively reek of the stuff. They eat it over there like minstrels, first thing in the morning. It can make your stomach hurl, let me tell you. Bloody ridiculous, if you ask me. They call themselves the best cooks in the world. My foot. We out-trump them any day of the week here in America. Let me tell you that." "Not to worry, Mr. Grimshaw," my mother had said politely. "The chicken casserole I've made this evening is very flavourful. It's devoid of any garlic, so I think you'll be reasonably satisfied. It's an old recipe of my mother's, which people usually enjoy." I had been on the floor playing dominoes with my brother Jack, my one ear perked up like a dog, as I concentrated on the game, while eavesdropping at the same time on my parents' conversation with the odorous man, whose every single second word was bloody, and it seemed he didn't have a nice word to say for anyone in town, not even our local pastor, which rarely was derogatory. "Bloody fool, that nincompoop! Do you know he had the cheek to visit me recently, to tell me to mind my manners, that I'm offending people around town? I said to him, 'Pastor Ferris, the Christian faith is about telling the truth, is it not?' He says to me, 'Of course.' I say to him, 'I tell people the truth, Pastor Ferris, and if they don't want to bloody hear it, it's not my problem. People pussyfoot around the truth these days, but I say it as it is. If I think you look like you've been dragged through a hedge backwards, I'll tell you. Maybe you don't want to hear it, but it's what it is. It's the truth. Why can't people accept that?" My father makes an awkward sound at the back of his throat, as if he's trying to clear it. "I think, Mr. Grimshaw, what Pastor Ferris was trying to say is that maybe when you're talking to people, you should be a little bit more discreet.
People can be easily offended and hurt. What's wrong with people these days? I keep saying that. They've got to bloody get over it. They've got no grit. If you say to me, Mr. Grimshaw, you have a dreadful odour problem, you're not smelling very good these days, I'll accept your comments with grace. I'll try and rectify and redeem the problem. I'll be grateful to you. I wouldn't take offence to it. How can you address an issue if no one tells you about it?
All of a sudden, our big ginger cat Sammy comes into the living room and jumps onto Mr. Grimshaw's lap and begins to settle on his lap, purring like a steam train, stretching out his long paws and beginning to look very settled and content, while Mr. Grimshaw is not quite sure exactly how to react. But he looks exceedingly put out about this presumptuous gesture on Sammy's part. Maybe it is true that cats are attracted to people that don't actually like them, like iron filings to a magnet. Sammy likes you, Mr. Grimshaw. I've never seen him so affectionate before.
Well, the feeling's not mutual, as you can see. Can you not get the bloody thing off me? I've never been terribly fond of cats.
I remove Sammy from Mr. Grimshaw's lap, but Sammy is persistent and returns to Mr. Grimshaw immediately. He affectionately rubs his sleek body against the man's lower legs, purring like a lawnmower. And every time Mr. Grimshaw pushes him away with his feet, Sammy sees the gesture as a big, exciting game and begins to play with Mr. Grimshaw's laces ever so enthusiastically. I can see the peevish man would like nothing better than to kick the cat off him, so it seems that he's champing at the bit, trying very hard to behave himself, and is inwardly fighting some self-restraint. So maybe the man has some boundaries after all, and there are some lines he will not cross. I don't think he actually wants to offend my mother, which is one up for the books.
Your cat's playing with my laces, says Mr. Grimshaw, biting his lips.
Ignore him, says my mother. If you give him attention, he'll be even more demanding, and you'll never be able to get rid of him. He might even follow you home. I can see he's taken quite a shine to you. Mr. Grimshaw doesn't look desperately pleased by this suggestion. I'm indicating to my brother with my second finger to follow me. We cautiously creep into the kitchen, while my mother is conveniently distracted in the living room with my father, entertaining our guest, both obliviously unaware that we have vacated the room for a brief second. Once in the kitchen, I surreptitiously pull a whole white garlic bulb from the string of garlic bulbs hanging on the hook above our kitchen range. I proceed to peel back 12 garlic cloves, which I neatly align on the wooden chopping board, exclusively reserved for garlic chopping. I whack them down with the back of a sharp knife, and then chop them finely, furiously fast, like a skilled chef. What are you doing with so much garlic? Asked my brother, looking bewildered by my industriousness. He begins to furrow his forehead in perplexment. You're not making garlic bread, are you? I grin cheekily like a Cheshire cat. Bro, it's called getting revenge in a subtle way. You heard Mr. Grimshaw. He loathes garlic. I thought I'd add a ton of garlic into the casserole to ruin his meal for him tonight. Brilliant! Why didn't I think of that? That's a fantastic idea, says my brother Jack, giving me a high five as he slaps his hand against mine. He was always game for a good laugh. We discreetly, unbeknown to my mother, who if she knew what we were doing would have been appalled, added 12 cloves of garlic to the casserole, stirring it all in, feeling certain we had ruined the dish. I can't wait until he tastes that, I whispered cheekily. It didn't matter to us in the slightest that we had ruined my mother's casserole. Not at all. That was insignificant. Getting one up on the old miserable codger was a satisfactory feeling indeed, especially after his mean comments about Jack and his violin. My brother was also more than willing to extract revenge. When my mother served out the chicken casserole that evening, bringing it over from the range to the kitchen table, I was surprised it smelt so good. You couldn't smell the strong, bitter, pungent garlic in the air as I was expecting. Still, I knew once Mr. Grimshaw had eaten a bite of the casserole, he would spit it out with disgust when he realised it was adulterated by a plethora of garlic. But I couldn't have been more wrong. My expectations were not magnanimously rewarded, as I'd so hoped. Nor did Mr. Grimshaw's benevolent reaction offer me any kind of satisfaction. Me and my brother were seated at the long oak wooden table in our kitchen that is neatly laid with shining glasses, white crockery, and a beautiful bowl of flowers in the centre of the table. I was holding my breath, clenching my knuckles so that the whites were showing, my eyes fixed on Mr. Grimshaw like a gog-eyed goldfish, as I waited with bated breath. My mother served up a large portion of steaming casserole to the hungry rancher. The one thing that ranchers in Colorado all have in common is they love their food and effortlessly work up a healthy appetite after expending a lot of physical exertion and energy out in the fields all day long, working with their cattle and managing their ranches. I was eagerly waiting for Mr. Grimshaw to hurl abuse at my mother about how he hated bloody garlic, and how she had in spite treacherously laced her casserole with garlic to deliberately upset him. Me and my brother exchanged sneaky, furtive glances as we watched Mr. Grimshaw put a mouthful of chicken and rice in his mouth, chewing it slowly. My eyes are so fixed on him, my heart is pounding excitedly in my chest. I am eagerly waiting for him to rudely spit the casserole out into the napkin. But it never happens. He has that annoying, contented, satisfied look on his face when someone is tasting something they're not expecting to enjoy so much, and then quite suddenly they discover it tastes quite marvellous, and they're pleasantly surprised. Mr. Grimshaw's eyes grow round with appreciation.
"My word," he says to my mother. "Sienna, you've excelled yourself here. This is quite simply the most marvellous chicken casserole I've ever tasted in my entire life."
My mother has won over Mr. Grimshaw most favourably. He's looking at her with doe eyes, as if he thinks she's almost as phenomenal as a chicken casserole itself. Maybe the best entrance point to his heart is through his stomach. By the way he attacked Orla at the bakery over the doughnuts, it would almost certainly seem so. "I told you it was good," said my mother, grinning widely from ear to ear, as she knew when she received a compliment from Mr. Grimshaw, he meant it from the bottom of his heart, as such flamboyant appraisal from the likes of him was rare indeed. I'm astounded by Mr. Grimshaw's reaction, so I hastily investigate the casserole for myself, certain that 12 cloves of garlic are going to taste poignantly strong. But I can't distinguish the garlic at all. The dish is more delicious than ever, almost as if the garlic has accentuated and intensified the other flavours of the dish, without being too dominant. Even my father comments on the casserole and says,
"Sweetheart, even if I say so myself, I agree with Mr. Grimshaw. To date, this is quite literally the most delicious casserole you've ever made."
When I informed my mother what we had sneakily done to the chicken casserole, she was gutted. "You mean you injected 12 chopped cloves of garlic into the casserole to get your back on Mr. Grimshaw? And he loved it." I'm trying to decide whether I'm amused or exceedingly annoyed. "Well, it proves one thing, Mummy. Mr. Grimshaw doesn't hate garlic as much as he thinks he does." To date, my mother now adds plenty of garlic to her chicken casserole during the cooking, and it always tastes amazing, and I'm not exactly sure why. "Why does Mr. Grimshaw have to be mean to everyone?" my brother Jack asked my mother once. "He's always upsetting everybody, hurting people's feelings." "Well, sweetheart," says my mother, "some people are naturally miserable. Maybe they're unhappy. It makes them feel better about themselves to bring others down to their level." "But why would anyone be miserable living here in Colorado? This is the best place to live in the entire world. It should be a criminal offence to be melancholy here." "I mean, when we went to Hong Kong, Mummy, there were people who lived in a tiny concrete, high-rise apartments. They were everywhere. Don't you remember them? They had no backyards. They hung their clothes on sticks outside the windows. They had the right to be sorrowful, but they were upbeat. But Mr. Grimshaw lives on a big farm with fresh air, mountain views, big sky, and I've never seen him smile once, not once. I feel sorry for his cows. I'm sure they must pick up his negative energy. Maybe it even affects the quality of the meat. You never know." "You make some excellent, valid points, sweetheart," says my mother. "But it's what's in here that really counts," she says, pointing to the heart. "You must remember we don't know anything about Mr. Grimshaw, do we? Maybe he's had a very sad upbringing. Who knows? We can't judge him too harshly. Let's just say people's enigmatic behaviour can often be traced back to their family roots or how they were actually raised. I heard a provocative true story once of a young kid being raised like a feral cat underneath the house. He was chained up night and day by his parents and brought in the cellar over the winter. But that child, when he grew up into an adult, he couldn't form any meaningful relationships with people. It was said he was one of the rudest, most contemptible characters that you could ever meet, possibly even more offensive than Mr. Grimshaw himself. So let's not be too quick to condemn the man. Even though Mr. Grimshaw always spoke his mind, he never revealed anything about his past to us. So theoretically, we never knew exactly where he came from, if he had any brothers or sisters or parents, or if indeed the rumours were true and he had been married at one time. He was not the kind of person that you felt comfortable about probing into his background without feeling as if you were coming across as a prying, interfering busybody. Think about it for a moment, sweetheart, pipes my mother again. If we were all the same, our lives would be dreadfully dull. You can say one thing about our small town. Everyone loves to hate Mr. Grimshaw. People adore gossiping about the dreadful things he said and did. Yet our lives would be a lot less colourful without the grumpy, disagreeable character. You have to admit that. Our Colorado farm had been twice as big over 170 years ago, owned by the Spencer family, where there'd been 2 farmhouses snuggled cosily together, in close proximity to each other, built lovingly by the 2 Spencer siblings, whom had successfully raised their own large families in 2 separate red-brick farmhouses, managing the farms together as a joint family business, where in those days all family members were actively involved in every aspect of running the farm, although often outside help was also recruited. In the last 50 years, the farms had been subdivided into 2 plots of substantial-sized land, which meant that Farmer Grimshaw's farmhouse was on top of the hill, and ours was at the bottom of the hill, which was far too close for comfort, as the farmhouses were almost on top of each other, with Mr. Grimshaw's house giving you the impression that it was looking down on ours with a contemptuous, smug disregard, as if to say, I'm infinitely more superior to you. Suffice to say, our farmhouses were separated from Mr. Grimshaw's property by a long wooden post and rail fence, which had always required steadfast maintenance over the years. Both properties were blessed by vast sprawling grazing meadows for cattle, upon which stable blocks, barns, ponds and outbuildings had been built. Ostensibly the land on the right-hand side of the valley belonged to us, while Mr. Grimshaw's land was all on the left-hand side. If you looked towards the furthest distance on the left-hand side of the valley, you would see Mr. Grimshaw's Aberdeen Angus black cattle grazing in the field, while rising up in the background, like a faint suggestive line sketched with an ultrafine white pencil, you would see the billowing silvery silhouettes of the mountains that are so bleached, indefinite, vague, they blend seamlessly into the cobalt blue sky. If you don't look close enough, you might not even know they were there at all. But although the craggy definitions are obscurely imperceptible, if you study the horizon assiduously, you discern all the subtle, ambiguous, ethereal shadows in a kaleidoscope of elusive purples and blue hues, shading the contours of those mountains. Needless to say, from the north side of the valley, both properties were fringed by a large precipitous woodgrove that rose up on a very steep hilly incline, with a stream that meandered over the hill and down through the farms further afield. But this woodgrove was jointly shared by both our adjoining farms. I'm not being biased, well maybe I am. If I'm being brutally honest with you, I believe our house was the more attractive of the 2 farmhouses, although I will concede that Mr. Grimshaw's property was nestled on a much higher elevation, so I imagine it must have possessed some prepossessing views over the valley that would easily outrival ours. To be fair, both the red-brick farmhouses complemented each other, like 2 twin buildings, although our farmhouse was significantly larger in size to Mr. Grimshaw's, as it was believed that Sadie Spencer, who owned our property, had over 8 children when she lived there. Both of the farmhouses are 2-story buildings, very rustic-looking, made from red brick, symmetrical with white sash windows, black shutters, 4 chimneys and wraparound porches supported by white columns with steps leading to very polished white front doors. Me and my brother were similar in age. I was 10, he was 11. We slept in our own bedrooms next door to each other, which was the advantage of living in such a large house. I had a queen-size platform bed, with several white wooden drawers underneath it, so that I could store all my stuff and keep the rest of my bedroom relatively tidy. This was my mother's ingenious practical idea, as she knew I was inclined to be rather messy. My mother had painted the walls in my room a deep burgundy colour, and I liked the colour as my duvet cover and curtains had accents of the burgundy and gold in the fabric, and the room looked pleasingly masculine. I always slept with my sash window wide open, where on the outside of my wall was a white trellising, where my mother was growing purple wisteria against the red brick. My bedroom was on the second floor, and was north-facing, so in the distance I could see the undulating curls of the hills that were elegantly graced by the towering verdant silhouettes of the Douglas firs, the blue spruces, and the ponderosa pine trees. I remember it was the beginning of a cruel, cruel summer. It arrived in Colorado that year, like an unwelcome hostile guest, with a swifter vengeance, like a steam train that chooses to belligerently bypass spring on its chugging journey through the seasons, holding us mercilessly to ransom, so we were fortuitously subjected to the soaring, unkind, muggy temperatures. I was quick to point out to my mother, if you're cold, you can put more blankets on your bed, but when you're hot, you cannot do much about it, unless you have effective air conditioning. Everything that year was insufferable. The excessive heat, the plants were wilting, the animals were tired and thirsty, and with my family, let's just say tempers were more than a little frayed. If that wasn't bad enough, the fan on my ceiling had broken down, which meant I was fighting a losing battle getting to sleep at night, and was seriously tempted to join my brother in his bedroom, where the fan actually worked. I remember the temperature outside my sash window was so warm, it felt like it was a sauna on the outside. Needless to say, most of the night I was tossing and turning. The heat was like an annoying sweaty hand that kept prodding me wide awake. But finally tiredness defeated the muggy temperatures, and against the odds I had fallen into a fitful sleep. I remember in my dream I heard this crashing sound, and then I got the sense that maybe this is not part of my dream at all, and that this noise is actually part of my reality. I then feel fingers prodding me sharply, as if someone is earnestly trying to wake me up. I think it's my brother Jack. I audibly groan. What does he want now? I've only just managed to get some much-needed shut-eye. I grumble, "Please, Jack, I'm hot. I've only just managed to get some sleep." I roll over, pulling the duvet over my head. I experience another sharp nudge. This time it's decidedly firmer and feels more urgent, as if my brother is really intent on getting my attention. Why doesn't he leave me alone? Doesn't he realise how exhausted I am? I can feel my mind jiggling with a resentful indignation. I manage to rise up out of my covers, hoisting myself up on my elbow, like a wary seal searching for an air hole under the ice, so that I can finally breathe. I sit up on my bed, against a plethora of fluffy pillows for support. I slowly open my eyes. It takes me a while to adjust to my natural environment, having been interrupted from the pleasantries of my dream state. For a moment, it's so hard to distinguish what is real and what's not. I find myself staring at this tenebrous shape that looks like a monstrous shadow person with bright yellow eyes that stare at me. I blink again, feeling so certain that this has got to be a dream, or just the most explicit haunting nightmare that I've ever had. But when I look up again, this huge monster is still staring at me. My first thought is, what the heck is that? I'm certain this has got to be a dream. There can be no other explanation for this. A cooler wind is now blowing through my window, while my deep burgundy curtains are blowing backwards and forwards ominously. I now am almost certain that I'm staring at a demon from hell. I mean, what else could it be? My bedroom is so dark that all I can see is the outlines of solid matter, from the bedside tables to the upholstered chair, and the open door of my closet that is now swinging precariously backwards and forwards in the breeze and making that ghostly squeaky sound that would make the more faint of heart burrow quickly under their covers in abject terror. I see this creature's distinctive pronounced profile, the rise and fall of a pointed head, that folds down into these gargantuan shoulders in a single seamless sweep. Let's just say it is possibly the most terrifying thing that I've ever beheld. I mean, this thing has to be 9 foot tall, 4 foot wide across the shoulder area, and covered in black hair that is more dense and dark than the night itself. Indeed, the lofty, mighty proportions of this imposing beast, with intimidating representing its middle name, it has made my room fade away into obscurity. This creature has almost become my room. He's that large. I feel tiny and inconspicuous in his company, like a tiny mouse in the presence of the household tabby, at the mercy of this daunting predator that I'm doubtful I can possibly trust. Inwardly, I'm wrestling with myself to scream, but it's a losing battle. My body is failing to cooperate with me. When I open my mouth, nothing comes out. I just sip air. My mouth feels dry and scratchy, like sandpaper, as if a thick fog has blocked the back of my throat. This creature's got to be a demon. And why is it here for me? I must have done something so bad to call up a demon. Is he here to take me to hell? Am I about to die? A cold chill descends down my spine. My whole body seems to freeze up like an ice statue. My hand trembles as I reach for my burgundy bedside lamp, and I press the switch on. A subdued light filters through my room. I'm expecting the demon to have disappeared. Isn't that what happens when you expose it to light? But he's standing there. The light shadows are magnanimously highlighting the creature's features. I can see the creature clearly. To my astonishment, I realize it's a Bigfoot. There's a Bigfoot in my room! How the hell did he get in here? The creature points to the open sash window, as if to answer my question. I'm amazed. He climbed up the trellising, entered my room, but why? What could he possibly want with me? That's when I realize he heard my thoughts. He knew what I was thinking. This is incredible. This creature is telepathic. The words actually managed to come out. What do you want? I'm still afraid. I mean, no one expects a Bigfoot to enter their bedroom in the middle of the night, and God only knows what he wants with me. But when my eyes study the creature, they're drawn to his eyes, and then the fear I felt only moments before subsides, like a large nail being plundered into a beach ball, and then it just relaxes and deflates. To date, I've never seen such kind, compassionate eyes before. When you look at eyes like that, it's impossible for you to feel fear, for you know you're in the presence of a great good. The creature is indicating for me to follow it down the red bricked wall of my bedroom, over the trellising. He needs to show me something, but what? The Bigfoot is indicating for me that he wants me to hurry up, so I rush over to my wardrobe and fumble around for my sneakers, which I throw onto my feet as quickly as I can, tying up my laces hastily, but in stiff knots. I really want to rush into my brother's bedroom and say, "Jack, there's a Bigfoot in my bedroom." I can't imagine what his reaction would be. I'd love to see it. He would absolutely believe I was winding him up. But I cannot do that. I can see that this male Bigfoot is impatient. He wants me to hurry, and I'm already slowing him down with my dawdling. I pull a cotton t-shirt over my boxers. I indicate to the Bigfoot that I'll go outside the house via the front door, as tackling the window trellising outside my window is more than a little precarious and rather dangerous. What if I slip and fall? I wouldn't attempt such a grievous fate in the cold light of day even, and I don't mind climbing trees, but the trellising on my outside wall, I'd never hasten to experiment with that. The creature has once again read my thoughts and intervenes without any prompting. I guess you could say he just throws me on his shoulders like a large sack of oranges. He climbs down the trellising outside my window, just balancing on it using only his big toe, I kid you not, to support his entire body weight. But he takes such wide steps down the trellising that we've reached the ground faster than you can say Jack Robinson. I just cling on to his shoulders tightly, pulling his body hair in my angst. But before I can express any misgivings, we're safely on the ground. That was quick. I'm seriously impressed. The Bigfoot is incredibly agile. He knows how to shift his weight so that anything he stands on can support his gargantuan body, which is incredulous. When I was on his back, I have to say I did not discern any foul odours. His body smell was pleasantly benign, and if he was inclined to smell bad, this heat wave would be the perfect opportunity.
I've smelt gym changing rooms, far more offensive than he was. The Bigfoot is indicating for me to get a move on. It's all right for him. He can glide like the wind, but I'm considerably slower. It's dark outside, but the air is so much cooler. It's such a relief. And a soft wind is fanning through the grass, its breezy currents brushing against my cheeks, sweeping my hair away from my face. Oh, wow, this is lovely. After all the hellishly hot weather we've been having of late, for it to be this cool, it's got to be exceedingly late at night or early in the morning. I stumble awkwardly over the tufts of grass, for my eyesight fails to see every bump and curvature in the soil, every rock that's hell-bent on tripping me up. We're running through the fields towards the woodgrove. The smell of the ponderosa pines is very pronounced. It's lovely. I just shadow the Bigfoot as his silhouette is all I can really see. The moon seems obscured by cloud cover, and only a soft trail of silvery light peppers the dark sky. I hear the sound of cows mooing, the occasional owl hooting, the rustle of leaves as we approach the grove. The Bigfoot suddenly becomes very still. He tiptoes with me and points to a form sitting under a tree. I hear these stifled sobs. Help her! Help her! A voice enters my head. I'm not sure whether it is the Bigfoot speaking to me or not, but I think it is. There's a young woman sitting next to the tree, and she's sobbing. I walk over to her and sit right next to her. The Bigfoot is nodding at me encouragingly. He's gesturing with his hands. Go on, help her.
Hello, are you all right? I don't mean to scare you. The woman looks at me through her tearful eyes. She looks oriental, as if she comes from Singapore or Thailand. I can't be sure. But what is she doing in the woodgrove, crying? Why is she so sad? And who is she? Who are you? She says to me. My name is Bryce. I live at the red brick farmhouse over there. Where are you from? My name is Quang, she says to me. I live at the farmhouse on the hill, next to yours. I think I've seen you before, in the field. You mean you live with Farmer Grimshaw? She nods and bursts into tears. Her tears roll down her cheeks. But why do you live with him? Because I'm his wife. You're Farmer Grimshaw's wife? Since when? He married me a week ago in Thailand. We came back here together. I thought it would be a whole new life for me in America. But Mr. Grimshaw, he's not a nice man. He says so many cruel things. Don't take it personally. That's what he's like. He's very rude to people. If he thinks you're ugly, he won't even hesitate to tell you so. One day I broke out in zits on my chin. He said to me that my spots looked like the Milky Way had tattooed its impressions across my face. My mother says he just doesn't think before he speaks. Do you mind me asking you a personal question? But why did you marry him? I wanted to come to America to have a whole new life here, to send my family money. I joined a marriage agency, and Mr. Grimshaw was interested in me because I spoke English. But when I came here to America, it's like he wants to hide me away from everyone in this house. He treats me like a servant. I do all the cooking and cleaning now. I don't mind that. But he ignores me all the time. I get so lonely. He told me he wanted to marry into my culture because his wife from Tennessee only lasted one day with him. And then after that, she filed for divorce. This isn't what I signed up for. I want to go back home to Thailand, to my people. I miss my family. I'm trapped here. I haven't got any money for an air ticket. How am I ever going to get back home? I wish I hadn't done this stupid thing. Everybody told me it was a stupid thing to do, but I just had these aspirations. I look up to see if the Bigfoot is there. He meets my eyes. I hear the words in my head. Help her, help her. Then he turns around and glides away. To cut a long story short, I brought Quang back to our home. She engaged in long, meaningful conversation with my mother. My mother knew a divorce attorney who helped Quang file for a divorce, and my mother actually brought Quang an air ticket and gave her spending money to get back home to her native Thailand. All these years later, my parents still send her money every year to help her family out. Needless to say, she warned other Thai girls not to go down that marriage route, as the grass isn't always greener on the other side, she told them. I never ever told anyone about the Bigfoot that entered my bedroom, but I think he picked up Kwang's sad energy. He knew she needed human help. When Farmer Grimshaw's back was turned, Kwang returned to the farmhouse to pack her stuff, leaving a note for Farmer Grimshaw. The extraordinary thing about this story is that after Kwang left for Thailand, it was like the Bigfoot knew I'd helped her, as I woke up one morning to find a large amethyst on the end of my bed, which I still treasure today. It's a magnificent piece, and when people ask me where I got it from, I usually just say, "You wouldn't believe me if I told you." I do believe Bigfoots are telepathic. The creature knew I'd helped Kwang. The amethyst was his way of thanking me. We never told Mr. Grimshaw that we'd helped Kwang escape his clutches, nor has he ever mentioned to us that he got married twice, but we know more about him than he actually realises. I'm sure my mother's absolutely right. There must be a sad story behind Mr. Grimshaw's life. But on the good side, if he hadn't been so miserable to Kwang, I would never have encountered a Bigfoot who was so eager to help a lost, distressed soul that he audaciously entered my bedroom on a hot summer's night. So there you are. That's my story. Wow, what an incredible story. Until next time, goodbye and good night.